Howdy. I start off with a comic, which is really fascinating, but might be very useful for this presentation. And I'll try to make this presentation as short as possible. So, this is a comic from Calvin and Hobbes, and the conversation goes something like this. How do they know the load limit on bridges, Dad? And the cars passing this bridge, there's a signboard for load limit 10 tons. So the reply comes, they drive bigger and bigger trucks over the bridge until it breaks. Then they weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. Oh, I should have guessed. Dear, if you don't know the answer, just tell him. So this is really the classic. It's a metaphor for coaching and training for endurance sport, isn't it? Most of us um, take training as an adventure. We really don't know how much is our real limit, and we want to push and push and push until the last straw breaks. And then what happens? We get injured, or something really bad happens, like overtraining, and we just can't get back into the normal mode of things. For some of you who have been in that red zone, you will know what I'm talking about. Um, so, really, the crux of the matter is to know yourself, to know the body, and if you're a coach, to know the athlete, and to design a training structure in such a way that you stress the athlete to an extent, yes, but never too much that they are not able to recover. And then you want to use that metric to monitor the athlete over long periods of time, such as weeks, months, maybe even up to years, for athletes who are participating in very big events like the Olympics, which is normally a 4-year cycle. But yeah, so really, we want a way to track what how hard we hit ourselves, how hard is the dosage in the training, um, how hard was it planned, and how hard did we feel when we did the training. So there are a number of ways that people have come with to describe external and internal training loads. So again, training loads are of two types, external and internal. What is very popular and popularly adopted is the external training loads. This is, it's a no-brainer. Um, all your external mechanicals come in this category. So your time, speed, distance, power, force, torque, sets, and reps in the gym, for example. It captures the biomechanics, the spatial kinematics, if you want to call it. So, for example, your shoe-mounted foot pod might be able to give you some joint angles. It might be able to give you forces, cadence, steps per minute, acceleration, ground contact time, COG movement, all that. It's a quantitative description of the training stress. It's all numbers. And if the device is consistent between one day and the next, the numbers won't just change. If it's a well calibrated instrument, then they will remain pretty objective, regardless of whether it's sun is shining or not. And so, therefore, it is an objective measure. And the problem might be that some of these devices are expensive. Or if they're not expensive, the software and the data you get might be complex. And overall, it might involve a high learning curve. So this might explain why even something like the power meter, although the adoption is increasing, not everyone rides his bike or her bike with a power meter, and this is quite true in India, for example. So the adoption rate is low because it's expensive and there's a learning curve to it. On the other hand, you have internal training loads. That is internal to our body. Okay, that captures the the physiology and the psychobiology and the neurophysiology of things as we exercise. So very popular among this is HR, which is heart rate. TRIMP is a way to it's a system analysis for heart rate. I won't get into that, but TRIMP is also used, especially by scientists for research. Blood lactate, quite common, popular in um, exercise laboratories and for testing athletes. And in fact, some of the metrics such as FTP is really a surrogate for blood lactate, and the whole point was to give athletes some way to measure themselves on the field and be close enough to what might be a corresponding blood lactate value. Then we've got VO2, again another very popular metric. VO2 is actually the oxygen consumption that changes as a function of exercise intensity, running speed on the treadmill, for example. And VO2 max test is a very popular test to measure your oxidative capacity. The point being that if you want to excel in endurance sports, you need to be blessed with a high potential for VO2 and a high potential to extract the VO2 in your cells, in your muscle cells. Then we got metabolite accumulation. We've got effort. There's no device to measure effort. But we all know what it is. As we grow up, we have a different perception of what pain is and what fatigue is and what an effort associated with not doing any effort is. So that could be pain. Whereas if you're really exercising hard, you might experience an effort that's associated with fatigue. So there's two types of effort. Perceived exertion, cognitive load. So again, it captures the neurophysiology and the psychobiology. So this is a really valuable nonlinear signal, and at the crux of it is, the question, when you get up in the morning, you ask yourself, how am I feeling? Or even if you don't, exaggerate and ask yourself, you're really running that question in your mind, before the workout. How am I feeling? And then pacing. Pacing is so much psychological. It's what you see in the races, for example, a track race. It's so psychological. So much psychology associated with it. It's not just one number. Riding a time trial on a bike is not just one number. There's motivation. There's the concept of reward. There's rivalry among opponents. All that factors into how you pace a race. And there's large numbers of books and papers written on just the subject of pacing alone. So it's a very complex topic. As opposed to external training loads, it gives you a qualitative idea, a description of how the workout went. People like to describe their workouts in different ways, in very different, colorful ways. And so it's a qualitative idea, and it's a subjective measure. So give the same workout to two individuals, and they might come out describing it in two different ways. Or one might crumble and the other might, say, this didn't hit me all right, I need something more than this. And so it's very subjective. And then depending on the time of day or the day of the week, you might feel for the same training load, objective training load, you might feel a different effort or perception of effort. And that's quite interesting. Much simpler to administer and very small learning curve. There is a small learning curve to it, but once you educate, then it becomes easier. And I would argue that perhaps the internal training load could be used among a wider audience, for a wider range of athletes, and also in countries where sport is just it's a minority thing, it's a minority activity. So really the crux of this discussion is training load is not just external training load or internal training load. It is a combination of both. Okay. And given that truth, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, meaning that, don't just concentrate on one side of this training load. Try to combine both, and you have a really powerful system to describe the training or make the training. So that's what this means. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you get rid of heart rate, for example, you might be getting rid of some really valuable information that you never knew unless you had the data. For example, very high level athlete could have maybe some issue with the heartbeats, or very, very high heart rates for some maximal intensities, and you might want to look into the heart rate and ask yourself, what's going on here? Why am I feeling so? Why is my heart beating so high? Yeah, am I dehydrated? Am I low on sleep and rest and recovery? Things like that. So once you have both, of course, you need the right instruments. A really a, an HR monitor without a battery is not the right instrument. There's going to be lots of drops, and arguably you're not going to get good data, even if you have, or if you're running or riding with a HR monitor. That instrument is not acting right. Uncalibrated power meter is not the right instrument. Um, and if you have some issues with your device, then you're not getting really, you're not ticking the uh, the objective measure checkbox here. It's not really an objective measure because you don't have the right instrument. And really, these are tools to facilitate uh, coach athlete communication and or athlete coach decision making. So if you want to change something in training, you need a basis to make a change. Or if you want to push yourself higher next year for a bigger goal, you need data from this year, and so you really need an understanding of your training loads to give a basis for making changes, or making decisions. So having understood that, um, this is a nice chart that comes from this paper. If anyone wants to read it, this is on the internet, but if you want me to share it with you, I can. This is a consensus statement among a group of sports scientists, and they've taken all these measures of load, and they've put it in this table. They've tabulated it, and some of the attributes on the top, as you can see, they've ranked it against some of those attributes. So cost, hardware needed, software needed, ease of use, valid, reliable, used to interpret, used to prescribe, variables. Okay, so let's just take two of these. So let's use one popular one, which is heart rate. Okay, if you look at heart rate and go left to right across this and read off the attribute, as I told you, it's low to medium cost. It doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Okay, hardware needed, yes, of course you need a hardware. Software needed, yes. Ease of use, very high. People, it's very easy to use, and so it's widely adopted. Is it valid? Yes, it's been measured and found to be valid in the lab. Is it reliable from day to day? Yes, it is a reliable measure. It's medium to high reliability. And then it's used to interpret and used to prescribe. Okay? And it's traditionally, a lot of coaches, and even today, a lot of coaches use heart rate to prescribe training. On the other hand, you look at something like power output. Cost, medium to high. Even today, the power meters are not cheap, and even a pedal power meter, costs something like $400, $500 easy. Hardware needed, of course, you do need it. Strain gauge it, or you need something like something at the pedal, so you need something at the rear wheel hub. Software needed, absolutely. You need something to process that data. Ease of use, low to medium. I wouldn't say low because you get power, then you need to know how to apply it. So I would really put that in the medium category. And in fact, with all these new metrics that are coming these days, with associated with power, the interpretation of the power data is not really easy. So it's a gray area. It's I would definitely say it's at the minimum it's got a medium ease of use, depending on the person. Is it valid? Yes. High reliability? Yes, it's high, provided you use the right instrument. Used to interpret and used to prescribe. Okay. So that's a good, and there's so many in this table that this is a good overview of metrics. And if you're a new coach and you have a wide range of athletes, a large number of athletes, and you're looking for some some methods to use that combine ease of use and also maybe a bit of complexity to capture objective loads and stuff, then you can refer to this. This is a good table. So let's come to RPE. Um, to to really describe it well, I have something from a, a paper which I want to read out, and I can share this paper. The perception of exertion can be considered as a configuration of sensations consisting of strain, aches, fatigue, involving the muscles and the cardiovascular and pulmonary systems during exercise. So that just goes back to what I was saying before. Perceived exertion is not something you feel when you're sitting on your couch with a remote control watching TV. Um, okay, you might feel some pain maybe in your knee as you're sitting down, but that's not associated with activity. Okay. Uh, they did a wonderful experiment back in I think 2004 when the exercise laboratory they had some stationary people. They had them injected with some lactate metabolites into their bloodstream, to their muscles, and it was interesting that when they surveyed these subjects, the subjects could really tell you know the difference between an activity and a fatigue associated with activity or an effort associated with activity, which is fatigue really, and pain that's not associated with any kind of movement. So there was a fine distinction there. And RPE is really combining both. So when you're doing exercise, yes, you will feel pain. You might feel pain. Hopefully, you don't. That's not a healthy way to train. But you will feel some degree of pain, but probably also some degree of fatigue and heavy light effort, depending on the intensity. So RPE combines all this. So it's a very good internal load metric, yeah. Of you might say it corresponds to the intensity of the workout. Now there are various instruments used to measure RPE. The Borg scale is the most popular one. Not most popular, but it came out initially and came out in the 1960s. And over the course of time, other scientists have come up with more simpler scales to use. The most popular one is the Foster scale that was first introduced in a paper by Carl Foster in 2001. And in this, there's so really this is the way it works. There's 0 to 10 rating, and there's verbal descriptors for each of the numbers. Okay, and these descriptors obviously have been designed very carefully to make it easy to communicate and interpret among wide groups of people, among wide ranges of sports. So 0 is, you're simply sitting at rest, you're not doing much work, you're not doing anything. 1 is very, very easy, 2 is easy, 3 is moderate, 4 is somewhat hard. Okay, so when you go out for a jog, for example, you might want to be between 2 and 3. That's a jog. Okay, you're feeling easy to moderate. Um, and then there's 4 and 5, which is somewhat hard, and 5 is hard. 5 would maybe be somewhere in the middle. But then after 5, it starts getting non-linear because 7 is very hard. See, the difference between 5 and 7 is not the same as the difference between 1 and 3, for example. Hard and very hard can be a big difference between that, and most of you who are experienced in training will know that. And then between 7 and 10, there's 3 numbers. 7 being very, very hard, and 10 being absolutely maximal. And I don't know of a situation where when we are doing endurance races, we ever reach 10. I think 10 is something you see normally in a laboratory when you're doing a VO2 max test, for example, or doing a RAM test, and you're absolutely going balls out to in the end. You got nothing left, and after the test is done, you just fall and crash to the ground. We have seen some triathlon races, some YouTube videos where people collapse and fall, but I don't know if that is a maximal effort. It seems more like something like dehydrations have been happening, and the athlete didn't manage their nutrition well, and consequently their muscles couldn't fire or something. So, you got to be really careful about marking your activity as a 10, right? Um, a tempo effort might be a 5, 6. You probably would be in the wrong place if you're at a 7. Um, Now keep in mind that the there's a difference between when you start an activity and towards the end. So for example, when you're doing a threshold run or a tempo run, what they say, which is somewhere between your lactate threshold and VO2 max, you might start out at a 4, somewhat hard, but by the time you're done with, like, say, 2 into 20-minute repeats, you might be at a 7. So you have to understand that as time progresses, this internal metric, which is RPE, also increases. So which it's valid, isn't it? So it's not objective, but it's very subjective. It changes over the course of time, and that's very nice to capture. Whereas if you look at maybe running power, for example, in that same session, that might be the same. You will maintain the same power, but your RPE is going to increase, maybe linearly, or sometimes maybe even non-linearly, depending on the ambient temperature and the weather conditions and things like that, your dehydration and stuff like that. So um, it's very important to take the scale and really just meditate on it for a little while before you apply it. Or if you're a coach, you need to make sure you communicate to the athlete how this is to be used. Um, Sometimes the athlete might not be a native English speaker. They might be more familiar with another language, and you might have to communicate to them in that language and use the best verbal descriptors that match up to the English verbal descriptors. Okay? So if there's any difference in the way you communicate what this is to the athlete, they will picture it in some other way, and consequently, when they rate their workout and communicate feedback back to you, you and them will have a different idea. So it's very important. I mean, as long as it's consistent, as long as the description is consistent and the feedback that you get back is consistent, then it's probably fine. But that's something to take into consideration. Okay, now we come to the application of this. So it's really simple. You have to basically rate each activity, as I said. So here's a training diary, a weekly training diary, where each session has been rated. So on Sunday, they went for a cycle ride of 100 kilometers. It's a century, metric century. And the athlete came back and rated it as a 5. 5 was a hard workout. Now, um, it's possible that the athlete did not start the 100-kilometer bike ride at a 5. It's possible that they started off at a 4, and towards the end it was a 5, and later when they rated it, they remembered more the harder parts of that workout, and so on average they said, okay, that's a 5. So, but we don't know what this workout really was. It could even be a race, a cycle race of 100 kilometers, so it could be 5. The duration was 180 minutes. Okay, so that's 3 hours, isn't it? 6 3 is 18. Yeah, it's 3 hours. So you take, just keep in mind it's minutes, it's not hours. Okay. And so the load really is the product of the RPE and the duration. So you get 940 for that particular workout. Next day they did a 5-kilometer jog and an extensive stretch. That was very, very easy, and it was a 25-minute workout. And so the consequent load was about 50. And then they did a number of other activities, skating and cycling and explosive weights and blah, 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 blah. In the end, you have a number of training loads. You have to summate, okay, all the training loads to get your weekly load. Okay? So, having the weekly load, this is a summation, not an average, this is a summation. Having the weekly load, you can also describe the variation between each of the loads in these days. That could be described by a metric called monotony. Okay? It's nothing but the standard deviation of of all these training loads. It's standard deviation, um, and you take that and multiply with the weekly load, I believe. But I'll just look into that. And then your strain is your load times monotony. Okay. So strain, yeah, sorry. So your monotony is your standard deviation, and then your strain is your load times your monotony, uh, which is 4284. So what this is saying is that okay, you have a training load, but you don't really know how that athlete is varying the training load each day. So if you have a very big, if the athlete is making sure they're varying it nicely, so one day hard, one day easy, one day moderate, one day hard, one day easy, then you get a lower, then you get a higher monotony, right? It's not so monotonous, I guess. Every day is not the same. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't vary the workout going from day to day, and it's every time it's hard, 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 and you know the classic saying, making your easy workouts hard and your hard workouts easy, something like that, you know, and you're just doing it hard, hard, hard most of the time, then you're gonna find out that that's not the way to go, and you know your strain might be really high. For example, if monotony is high, that means the standard deviation is low, um, then strain might be high. So you just want to make sure that you know this is the thing you want to monitor. So over long periods of time, say multiple weeks, you want to monitor the strain. And something we described here, the injury is when the loads increase and exceed the tissue capacity. So strain is what you want to monitor from week to week to week to week. And maybe in the fourth week, athlete gets injured, you can actually look back into the training diary and look at the weekly loads and the strains. Um, a strain is actually a mechanical term, right? I mean, when you like, for example, pull a metallic object, and if it doesn't change its shape, then strain is nothing but the uh, the change in the geometry of that object. But I guess it's nice to distinguish between strain and stress. They're two different things. Here, the strain is really the um, it's a correlate of the load and the damage that perhaps that load can do on your body, on the muscles, for example, or your tendons or your soft tissues. Um, So yeah, this is a nice chart which shows how the load can be charted. This is days on the x-axis, and you can see that um, the coach who has charted this has charted the planned load, okay, which is the line with the square markers. But then the actual load that the athlete reported back was somewhat lesser, right? And then in the last days, like day 91 or day 77 onwards, for example, they just couldn't meet it. There was some difference there, some appreciable difference, and this is something that you can look at, and a coach can ask, wait a minute, what's happening here? Why is there the difference between what I'm planning and what the athlete is coming back with? And should I increase the loads to make up that gap or something? You know. So, and that might fire back. So you have to be very careful with interpreting this. Um, and then so that was the weekly and the daily load actually. So the weekly load is just an average of the daily load, but the daily load has also been shown on the same chart. And you can see that in the competitions it really increases, but you can see how it keeps going up and down, up and down, up and down. So it's not very monotonous. Okay, there's a good variation, and arguably this is how athletes should really train. One day should be easy, one day should be hard. If anyone wants to get this chart, it's in this paper by Carl Foster. And this paper came out in 2001. This is where he showed the Foster scale for the first time. Um, yeah, just another example. This is probably more familiar to triathletes, where they do 3 different sports in a week, including strength training, and they have rated each session. They've taken the product of the session and the session RPE and obtain the training load. So, having said all that, RPE is just like any other tool. There's a lot of there's a catch to it. You have to some ifs and buts. You have to apply it well, knowing what are these situations where sometimes it doesn't apply well. So the first one is, the coach planned RPE and the athlete rated RPE are mismatched. Yeah, that's what we saw here. Um, there's a decent match in the first few weeks, but then it starts getting wider and wider and wider, and so you might want to know why that is so. And there's a neat paper that I found which addresses this topic, and I'll read it out. Some solutions should be discovered in order to solve the inconsistencies between coach prescribed and player perceived RPE, such as throughout the scheduled training, coaches should keep in mind the specificity and individual characteristics that might affect the internal load of each individual. So basically, know your athlete. Okay, if you're training like 200 people, you need to know each one. That's why small groups works really. Um, you got to know the athlete well, and so that will address some of the differences between what you are prescribing and what they're coming back with. You can supplement the use of HR monitors to assist a new RPE user to match their perceptions with the intensity of their training. That's a very good advice, actually, and that's goes back to what I was saying. You don't want to use any method in isolation. So an easy, cheap, widely adopted way can be using HR and RPE in combination. Okay. Controlling the relationship between scheduled and perceived training load of coaches and players, athletes, respectively, might improve performance by optimizing the training load periodization and preventing injuries and illnesses. So, really, this chart here, the coach should really ask the athlete if they're using that system correctly, and the coach should also know the athlete, whether they are planning this training correctly. So if you want to plan for an event and make sure the athlete is getting the right training loads without getting injured, you really want to try and correct this graph if it requires correction. Issue number 2. Okay, this is one that is very commonly asked. So what happens if you have a very long duration submaximal effort and you see RPE drift? So, I addressed some of that before. So when you start, RPE could be a low value, but when you end, it could be a high value. It's difficult as time progresses. But, that's not any different than what HR does, really. HR, as you start, your HR is somewhere, but then, it slowly drifts, and that could, that's really giving you some information about what's happening in the body, right? So that's what I've said here. It's not a unique problem to RPE. It also affects heart rate, and it captures the true toughness of a workout and the transient nature of a workout, right? So that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And in fact, I would question it if your RPE at the beginning of a workout and the end of a workout is exactly the same, unless you're doing something really, really easy. It shouldn't be. There should be some drift. So that's not really a weakness of the method. I would put it more into the strength bracket. Okay. So, if you're doing a 6-hour, 7-hour ride, for example, it is true that the effort is not easy. At the end of the 7th hour, you're feeling it. If you're feeling it in your legs are tingling. You want to stop and have a meal. You want to fill your bottle. Or for some of us, we just want to stop and get back home. And so, then the real question is, what RPE do you use? Do you use the end value RPE? Do you use the starting RPE? Well, I would say after 15 to 20 minutes of completing your workout, within that window, rate that workout and think about sort of an average descriptor for that workout, an average descriptor, okay, among these descriptors. And then that's what your feeling is. And so your real training load is the duration times that average, okay? Number 3 is some people just will not know how to apply the scale. Well, that's like anything else. You need awareness and education. you have to, as a coach, you have to focus on explaining this to the athlete, how the scale works. A scale, it's like a scale in a survey. It's an instrument, and so there is some awareness needed on how to use that scale, and that's the responsibility of the coach if you're coaching an athlete, or if you're an athlete using this for yourself, then you need to know how really to use it. Um, One thing to keep in mind, which some papers are treating or have treated, is the issue of age dependence. So young athletes might not really be able to describe their workouts well. If you're asking how running around a football field felt to a small person, like maybe a 10-year-old, maybe they might want, they might laugh and say, I didn't feel tired. They might be uh, very overconfident in saying that, whereas maybe someone else might be very, very honest. Adult human beings, they have a wide range of, wide experience on what is really hard and what is easy effort. So they might be able to discriminate more, make, fine tune adjustments to how they rate RPE. So you have to be very careful of age. So if you're using it with young athletes, then maybe the Foster scale might not be the best. For young athletes, there are other scales to use. So that's a topic we won't get into. It's outside the scope of this discussion, but just be mindful of the age of the athletes you're describing, you're working with. One important thing, rating of RPE has to be done within 10 to 15 minutes of activity ending. What usually happens is, because the RPE tool requires you to enter something in a training diary or go online and enter something in on a software or app, you might forget about it, and then only next day you wake up, oh, I had to enter that information in, and then you go in and enter something, and chances are what you thought about that exercise or activity on the day of versus the next day might be two different things. Some of you might have memory loss or memory fogging. You might have some differences in day to day and how you recall how that workout went. So be very careful about that. You want to just do the rating within 15 minutes and not exceeding 20 minutes, I would say. Keep that memory fresh. The last one is interesting. RPE derived training load, that is duration into RPE, may not differentiate properly between two very different types of activities with different RPEs. So you have a different RPE score for each activity, but when you calculate the training load, they come out to be more or less identical. So how do you look at that and go, okay, which one was more harder, or which one was more easier? And this is a very interesting question, right? I had a discussion with Ross Tucker, who is one of the prominent sports scientists from South Africa. He also has a website, Sports Scientists. They do their sports science takes on endurance sports on their website. It's very good, but he's also very active on Twitter. He says it's an excellent question. Is there a simple answer? No. And your response to that depends on the details and what you're managing through monitoring. So very important to know what sport it is, what is the activity. For instance, I know some professional teams in rugby that will use RPE for field sessions and cardio, but for weight sessions, use the total weight lifted. So that means that you probably have to. So if you're doing different activities, for example, what he's saying is that if you're a triathlete and if you're lifting weights and also running and also cycling, you might want to associate the RPE with the specifics of the activity, right? And maybe not so much the sort of an average effort. It's associated with what's going on in that session. Another option is to break a field training session into intensity zones, and then they track time spent in each zone. So they assess load with much more resolution than sRPE might allow, because the risk factors for either injury or overtraining differ in high-speed interval. Yeah, that's true. So it's kind of like your training session that say you're doing interval training. You're gonna have intensities fall into different intensity zones. You probably spend maybe 20 minutes in your tempo zone. Maybe you spend 6 minutes in your zone 5. Maybe majority of that, like 30 minutes, you spend walking around or jogging around in zone 1, zone 2. So what he's saying is you might want to rate, um, you want to maybe specifically address the load in each of those zones and break down the RPE specifically for the segment of that session. So if you're like running really really hard, so let's say you're doing an interval, right? You're doing 400-meter repeats. You're going to rate your effort for the 400-meter repeats, not the combination of the 400-meter repeat and the jog or the recovery walk. Okay, that's what he's saying there. That might, give you a more finer scale for assessing what the load was. You might be able to discriminate more easily there. He says, in my experience, even for running, cycling, sRPE for intermittent training is a lot trickier to interpret. You almost need to compartmentalize RPE on time to on time and total session. Yeah. So sRPE then is not a global variable. You have to look at the specifics and segment the workout and then rate each segment of the workout. I can understand what he's saying. High intensity training, like for example your track sessions where you're doing repeat intervals, it's not very easy to rate RPE. So for those kind of workouts, I would be a little more careful. In fact, if you're a coach training a track athlete, I would come up with a specific system for that athlete to use. So if it's a spreadsheet, that spreadsheet has to be designed in a very specific way for that athlete. Then, for example, someone who really enjoys going long duration and doing long easy runs and stuff like that. So be mindful of intermittent sports and intermittent workouts. That's a bit trickier to do. And in fact, the same thing applies to power. If you have a very very intermittent workout, for example, lots of stochastic things happening in your power profile, your time series, then it's not easy to describe that with a single number such as average power. And that's why they came up with normalized power. And even now they say that normalized power really doesn't address everything about the stress of of that workout. But then it's still better than average power, right? It's still better than average power. The other way to add some resolution to sRPE would be to gather 2 or 3 sRPEs, one for the whole body, another for the muscle specific RPE, maybe another for mental RPE or something similar. You could weight risk factors that way, but it's a trade-off against simplicity. Absolutely. This is like the highest resolution you can probably get to rating this workout using RPE. So you use muscle factors, you use mental factors. So one example, okay, you do a workout, you're doing a night session, interval training for running, okay? You've had a really long day and you were standing on your feet in the factory, you were running around everywhere, and now you have to now do this workout at 7 p.m. Your mental load is already very, very high. And you're going into this workout thinking, damn, I really want to be here? So mental load, you can, rate your mental sRPE for that session. You could say maybe, I feel 5, and that's not probably a great descriptor for mental aspects. But yeah, you could say, I'm starting out at the 5. And then once you do the interval training, you want to assess how your muscle feels, and then you want to rate muscle specifically with the descriptor. Maybe it's very hard, number 7. Okay. So for each one, you have a specific sRPE, and then you can get a specific load for that, and then you weigh each load against the risk factor. So mental load is not a big risk factor, right, for injury, but it might be. You never know. For example, if you're track training with like maybe 10 chaps, and if you are so loaded mentally that you can't focus and you can't concentrate, and you can't focus on where you put your step, you might just bang into someone else, and sooner or later everyone is on the ground and you just injured yourself. Mental fatigue, and it's a bit like mental fatigue is a bit like going without sleep, right? I mean, you can test it. If you're going on a night with less sleep, next day you wake up, you're not as attentive, you're not sharp. It feels like you had a little bit of alcohol, but you really haven't drunk anything. It's just that you're feeling fatigued. You haven't refreshed your mind. So mental RP, I would argue, it can be a factor in illness and or even injury. You just have to be apply it specifically to that sport, to that scenario. Okay, so I've exceeded the time limit, but I hope this is a very good refresher to some of you who are using RP, and then a good tutorial for some of you who absolutely have no idea what this mysterious thing is. Um, we started off with a comic. We looked at the two types of internal and external training loads and the value of each. Um, the crux of the thing being, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. As much, collect as much data as you can, but then use the most simplest ones and use the metrics that give you the most intelligence, your most bang for the buck. This paper is, it really classifies the different metrics available against all these attributes. So that's a nice one for coaches and athletes to use if you're confused about all these metrics. We talked about the instrument of RPE, which is, in my case, which I like to use, is the Foster scale, the modified Foster scale. It goes from 0 to 10. It has specific verbal descriptors, and so you have to apply this really well. Okay, and the coach has to communicate how to use this to the athlete well as well. An example of how that was, of how you can rate each workout in a weekly mesocycle, for example. You get your weekly load, your monotony, and your strain, and then you can plot any of these things. You can plot monotony, for example, or you can plot strain. Actually, strain captures monotony and the load, so strain would be a nice thing to plot as well. But here in this chart, coach has plotted the loads. And finally, the troubleshooting that we looked at, some of the things that you can hit up against when you use this, and they are very well addressed here. It's like any other tool. You need awareness, but there are some specific situations where applying this is a bit more tricky. So if you're a paid coach and if there's lots of stakes on the table, if it's a high level athlete and a delicate athlete you're working with, maybe, then you might want to introduce finer resolutions for RPE before describing, before charting the data and planning the next sessions. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for listening. Yep, bye.